Consider a September day in 1066. As the sun rises over England's verdant fields, an army can be seen approaching in the distance. Not any army, though. They are the Vikings, the most dreaded warriors in Europe, under the leadership of Harald Hardrada, one of Norway's greatest monarchs. They think England is within their grasp after their recent resounding victory. They are unaware, however, that a hidden weapon will fundamentally alter the path of history in the next few hours. A weapon so potent that it will end a period of Norse invasions of England and destroy an entire Viking army. The Battle of Stamford Bridge is told here. Few people are fully aware of the conflict that altered the course of nations. We must travel back in time and examine the circumstances that preceded this crucial moment. According to the medieval calendar, 1066 was not just another year. It was a year of crises, ambition, entwined fates, and the impending spectacular collision of historical forces. A political storm had been building for decades, was centered on England. Who would govern that island, and the fate of all European culture would be decided by the events that were about to take place. A catastrophe rocked the foundations of English sovereignty at the start of January 1066. The King of England, Edward the Confessor, passed away without leaving a direct heir. His passing represented more than just the passing of a king. It brought about one of the bloodiest and most complex succession crises in medieval history. After more than 20 years in power, Edward's failure or unwillingness to have a successor created a power vacuum that several claimants were keen to fill. And they were not your typical assertions. Each was adamant on claiming the English throne, had devoted forces and strong arguments. Harold Godwinson was the first and most direct beneficiary of Edward's passing. Despite not having royal ancestry, Harold was the most powerful person in England, second only to the monarch. He commanded the allegiance of most of the English nobles and ruled over large areas of land as Earl of Wessex. In addition to being a skilled administrator and seasoned military leader, Harold had an advantage over other claimants. At the time Edward passed away, he was in London. It turned out that being physically close to the center of power was key. The Archbishop of York anointed Harold King of England the day after Edward's passing. Harold's coronation was quick, almost rushed, as though he understood that time was his worst enemy. However, Harold's assertion was not going to be accepted. Another man in Normandy, on the other side of the English Channel, was keenly watching events in England. William, the Duke of Normandy, was seeking the English crown himself. Years before, William said Edward the Confessor had promised him the throne. William further asserted that Harold had promised loyalty to him on a contentious trip to Normandy in 1064. William was adamant on using blood and blood to support his claim. Whether it was real or not, he started putting together an invasion force right away, building a fleet of ships and recruiting soldiers from all around France. Though it would take months to complete, the Norman invasion was in the works. A third contender, meanwhile, watched with increasing curiosity in the far north of Europe. As the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, whose name roughly translates to the merciless or the stern, was perhaps the most experienced and formidable fighter of his time. Harold was not your typical man. His life was a story of epic proportions. He had been a member of the elite Viking soldiers known as the Varangian Guard, which guarded the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. He had fought in conflicts from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, accumulating unfathomable wealth and a reputation for fierceness that made kings shudder. Harald Hardrada was a truly towering figure, standing more than 2 meters tall, and his ambition matched his size.
And pact between Harthacnut, the former king of England and Denmark, and his predecessor, Magnus the Good, served as the foundation for Harold's claim to the English throne. This pact stated that both kingdoms would pass to the other if either of them died without heirs. Harold saw this arrangement as sufficient grounds, despite the fact that it was decades old and legally questionable. More significantly, he possessed a vital ally within England itself, as well as the ships and men to support his claim. Harold's brother, Tostig Godwinson, was banished. An intriguing component of this political riddle was Tostig. He had served as Earl of Northumbria, but in 1065 a rebellion broke out as a result of his harsh reign and unrelenting taxes. Harold, his brother, had turned against him and backed the uprising in an effort to keep the country peaceful. After being sent into exile, Tostig harbored resentment and a desire for revenge. He wandered Europe for months in search of supporters to help him retake his territories and get revenge on his brother. He discovered an ally and the ideal tool for retaliation when he met Harald Hardrada. Harald Hardrada and Tostig formed an alliance because their goals were complementary. Harold desired the throne in England. Tostig desired to destroy his brother and regain his earldom. Together, they started organizing what would be the largest Viking invasion of England in many years. Harold put up a formidable fleet of about 300 longships, the dreaded Viking drawers that had plagued the coasts of Europe for generations. These ships carried between 10 to 15,000 warriors, the best of Scandinavia's fighting men. These were guys who had been raised with swords in their hands, who saw combat death as the highest honor, and who had never heard the word fear. This enormous armada sailed down the east coast of England and along the Scottish coast in September of 1066. It was a bold plan. Take control of York, the second most significant city in England, and use it as a springboard to capturing the rest of the kingdom. Communities along the coast were terrified when the Viking armada arrived. Couriers rode rapidly south, drove animals inland, and abandoned villages. On September 20th, only 2 miles from York, near the village of Fulford, the first significant battle was fought. Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria rallied their armies. Perhaps 5,000 men made up the English army, but they were up against Harald Hardrada at the height of his military might. Fulford was a bloody and decisive battle. The Vikings completely destroyed the English army thanks to their superior fighting expertise and Hardrada's brilliant leadership. Although Edwin and Morcar nearly escaped with his lives, their forces were destroyed. The road to York was open. York gave up without a struggle. There was nothing the citizens could do. The city walls could not sustain a prolonged siege by such a large force, and their defending army was either dead or scattered across the fields of Fulford. Harald Hardrada and Tostig, tired but triumphant, entered the city with supplies and hostages in hand. In just a few days, they had conquered northern England. Nothing appeared to be able to stop them. The Vikings rejoiced, divided their spoils, and planned for the future. They had decided to pick up more prisoners and supplies at a place known as Stamford Bridge, about 8 miles east of York. Hundreds of miles to the south, however, something remarkable was happening. When Harold Godwinson heard of the Viking invasion, he took a decision that shows why he was regarded as one of the best military leaders of his era. Harold decided to march north right away and surprise the Vikings with a swift and devastating counterattack, rather than waiting for Harald Hardrada to approach him or to give the invaders time to consolidate their victories. Military historians believe Harold's next actions rank among the most spectacular forced marches of the Middle Ages. 2 days following the defeat at Fulford, Harald Hardrada and Tostig were putting the finishing touches on their triumphant plans. Suddenly, the news arrived. Harold Godwinson had arrived, and his English army was with him.
Together with local militias known as the Dreaded, he assembled his army, the Huskarls, the finest of English warriors, and set out on a march that was beyond the limits of human strength. It's about 220 miles from London to Tadcaster, which is close to York. In just 5 days, Harold traveled this distance. This indicates that his army was moving down medieval highways, which were essentially dirt tracks, at a pace of more than 40 miles per day, while transporting supplies, armor, and weaponry. The first indication of the hidden weapon that will wipe out the Vikings was this forced march. The technology wasn't brand new. It wasn't an innovative method of fighting. It was something far more basic. It was velocity. It was unexpected. It was the capacity to show up when and where the adversary least anticipated it. Despite winning hundreds of battles, Harald Hardrada had never encountered a leader with Harold Godwinson's boldness and tenacity. Harold arrived at Tadcaster, which is only 15 miles from York, on September 24. Despite his men's fatigue, he did not give them a break. He marched through York the following day, September 25, and proceeded straight to Stamford Bridge, where he was sure the Vikings would be assembling. No one in York had had time to tell Harald Hardrada about his amazing speed. The English force was not being chased by any mounted messengers. The attackers were not warned by any signs of fire on the hills. Harold moved faster than anyone could have in the Middle Ages. Harald Hardrada and his Vikings were enjoying a calm day at Stamford Bridge. Many warriors had left their heaviest armor aboard their ships, which were anchored miles away at Dyken, and the September sun was shining brightly that morning. The mood was laid back, almost joyous, as they awaited the arrival of the local hostages. On the banks of the Derwent River, a few men took a nap, some exercised with swords, while others played dice. No defensive formations were ready, and there weren't enough sentries. Why should there be? Only 5 days before, they had routed an English army. They couldn't be threatened so rapidly by any force in England. Something then materialized over the horizon, transforming that bright day into a nightmare. Dust. There was a huge dust cloud coming up from the York Woad, and amid that dust, thousands of iron axes, spears, and helmets reflected the light of the sun. There was an army coming, and it was coming quickly. After a moment of confusion, the Vikings recognized the awful reality. When Harold Godwinson and his whole army arrived, they were utterly unprepared. Harald Hardrada was not the type to lose his cool. He maintained his composure and began to organize his forces, even in that dire situation. However, the circumstances were dire. The English army was almost upon them, and his troops were dispersed across a vast region, many of them without their full armor. In those conditions, Hardrada did what any shrewd leader would do. He hurriedly requested reinforcements by sending messengers racing back to Rickall, where the rest of his troops and supplies were stored. He had to buy time. At this point, topography becomes essential to understanding the conflict. As the name implies, Stamford Bridge was a bridge that crossed the Derwent River. Under normal circumstances, the river wasn't very deep or wide, but its banks were muddy and slick, making it difficult to cross quickly, especially for a full army. The bridge itself was small, probably built of wood, and could only accommodate a few men walking side by side. This choke point would play a significant role in the subsequent events. Harald Hardrada immediately formed a defensive line on somewhat raised ground by relocating most of his soldiers to the east side of the bridge. His suicidal goal was to delay the English as long as possible, so he left a smaller force on the west side of the bridge. One of these warriors has a name that history has forgotten, but his deeds have become legendary. With a two-handed combat axe in hand, this lone Viking positioned himself on the slender bridge and proclaimed that no Englishman would cross as long as he was alive.
Although what transpired next has become a legend, it is supported by numerous historical accounts. For a significant amount of time, this lone Viking warrior was able to hold the entire English army's vanguard at bay. Only one or two men could attack him at a time due to the bridge's narrowness, and he repeatedly let them down with strong axe strikes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that before he was ultimately vanquished, he murdered 40 men by himself. According to legend, an ingenious English soldier eventually succeeded in floating beneath the bridge in a barrel or hollow wood and used a spear to penetrate the Viking from below. The story depicts the desperate savagery of the impending conflict, whether it is true or not. The actual combat started when the English eventually crossed the bridge with force. Harald Hardrada had established a strong defensive formation in the time that his men's heroic desperation had bought him. The Vikings used a traditional strategy known as the shield wall formation, in which fighters stood shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping to form an almost impassable barrier. Spears and axes were ready behind this wall of iron and wood, ready to destroy anyone who came near. This formation had served in innumerable conflicts, from the steppes of Russia to the fjords of Norway. However, Harold Godwinson possessed something that the majority of the Vikings' prior rivals did not. He possessed what were maybe the best infantrymen in Europe at the time, the Huskarls. Men who devoted their entire lives to the art of combat, the Huskarls were specialists. Wearisome weapons with blades that could split a horse in two and slicing through armor like butter, they carried Danish axes. They had been trained to fight in close formation since they were young, and they also used the shield wall. When two shield barriers collided, it took skill, willpower, and endurance rather than technology or numbers. It must have been a cataclysmic first encounter between the two armies. Imagine thousands of guys racing against one another, screams of pain mixed with war cries, and the sound of metal hitting metal and wood hitting wood. While axes and swords searched for exposed flesh, fighters on the front lines pushed with their shields in an attempt to breach the enemy's defenses. It was the most terrible kind of fighting, when men could really smell their foe's breath, and the ground was so slick with blood that it was difficult to stay balanced. Harald Hardrada fought on the front lines like a legendary berserker, even though he was in his 50s, which was an advanced age for the period. His warriors were moved to acts of extreme courage by his commanding presence and renowned talent. However, the fact that many of his men lacked complete armor began to wear thin. The well-equipped English Huskarls were ravaging the Norsemen, but the Norsemen remained firm. With unwavering resolve, they were carrying out their vow to fight to the end.
At that moment, the battle's balance was irreparably altered. On that horrific day, one of the thousands of arrows launched reached its mark. An arrow pierced Harald Hardrada's throat, killing the last great Viking monarch, the warrior who had fought from the Mediterranean to the Arctic.
He fell, and his demise dealt a severe blow to Viking morale. Harold's brother, who had been banished, took over right away and attempted to reorganize the troops, but the damage had already been done. Hardrada's passing was more than just a commander's loss. It was the death of a living legend, a representation of Viking might. When Harold Godwinson noticed the disarray in the enemy lines, he proposed terms of combat surrender. He reached out to his own brother Tostig, promising him forgiveness and the return of his lands in exchange for his submission. Several chronicles document Tostig's response. What would Harold give Harald Hardrada? He inquired. Harold said that, given his height, he would grant the Norwegian king 7 feet of English land, if not more. That is to say, just a grave. Instead of betraying his companions and taking his brother's charity, Tostig declined the offer and decided to die with them.
With fresh vigor, the combat went on. The Vikings fought with the fierce rage of men who knew there was no way out, while being disturbed by the loss of their king. However, the long-awaited reinforcements from Rikdal arrived at the most inconvenient time for the Norsemen. One of the Viking leaders, Steinor, showed up with the new troops that had been abandoned with the ships. They had ran 8 miles in full armor from Rikdal to Stamford Bridge, and many of them arrived so worn out that they passed away from weariness before they had even fought. Nevertheless, their arrival extended the struggle for several more brutal hours and gave the Vikings new hope. In the Norse sagas, this latter stage of the conflict was referred to as the Storm of O, a reference to Einstein's name, as well as the ferocity with which his troops engaged in combat. However, after a whole day of unrelenting fighting, their adversary had demonstrated its dominance. Despite their fatigue, the English Huskarls kept their formations and discipline. They eliminated the last areas of Viking resistance in a thorough and systematic manner. The Battle of Stamford Bridge ended that September evening as the sun started to set. There were dead all over the field. Between 6,000 and 9,000 Vikings, including Harald Hardrada, Tostig, and the majority of Norway's fighting elite, may have perished that day, according to varying estimates. Although the English side suffered heavy losses as well, possibly 2,000 or more, they had achieved a comprehensive and unambiguous victory. Only 24 of the 300 ships that had delivered the Viking invasion force needed to return to Norway with the survivors. The massacre was enormous in scope. However, what was the actual covert weapon that day that wiped out the Vikings? The military technology was not new. It was not dominance in numbers. The size of the armies was about equal. The weapons weren't superior. The equipment employed by both sides was similar. Combining tactical and strategic elements to produce a clear advantage was the real hidden weapon. The first was Harold Godwinson's march, which was remarkably fast. The Vikings were caught completely off guard by this remarkable logistical achievement, the march from London to Stamford Bridge in just 5 days. One cannot undervalue the strategic surprise that ensued. Before facing Harold's main force, the Vikings anticipated having weeks, if not months, to cement their victories in the north. Instead, while they were dispersed, many without proper armor, and distant from their supply bases, they were attacked within days. The English Huskarls' professionalism and discipline came in second. They were battling on their own territory, with everything on the line, and these elite warriors were the finest the Vikings had to offer. The key to their success was their capacity to hold formations for hours on end while fighting efficiently. The tactical leadership of Harold Godwinson came in third. He positioned his soldiers as best he could, taking use of the bridge's potential to postpone the first Viking onslaught.
He kept his men under control throughout the conflict, kept them from disintegrating as the fighting grew more intense, and took advantage of every opening in the enemy's defenses. The utilization of information and intelligence came in fourth, and possibly most crucial. Harold was fully aware of the Vikings' precise location and arrival time. He planned the ideal surprise strike using this knowledge. It was all about timing, and Harold had it just right. Despite their skill and courage, the Vikings were unable to overcome the deadly synergy formed by these circumstances. The hidden weapon was essentially a better way of fighting a war, a more sophisticated and comprehensive strategy that brought together tactical discipline, information, strategic mobility, and inspirational leadership. The Battle of Stamford Bridge had far-reaching and enduring effects. It was the end of an era for Norway. Norway would never again be a significant danger to England after Harald Hardrada's death and the devastation of a large portion of the Norwegian warrior elite. The Viking invasions that had plagued Europe for more than 200 years were mostly done.
A Viking army would never try to take over England again. The win ought to have been the biggest victory of Harold Godwinson's life. He had proven himself a worthy king, rescued his realm from attack, and vanquished one of the greatest fighters of all time. However, destiny had other ideas. Harold and his weary army were still in the north 3 days after the fight when the news that would alter everything came in. With his invading army, William of Normandy had set foot on England's south shore. Harold's absence had allowed the Norman Duke to make his move. Harold was at a loss. In order to confront this new threat, he had to march his weary troops back south, another hard march of more than 200 meters. He had lost some of his finest fighters at Stamford Bridge, and his soldiers were worn out, and many were injured. Harold nevertheless mustered his army and marched to William's side. Only 19 days after Stamford Bridge, on October 14th, 1066, the two armies clashed in the vicinity of Hastings. Though Stamford Bridge was largely responsible for the outcome at Hastings, the Battle of Hastings is much more well known. Harold's army had fought too hard at Stamford Bridge, marched too far, and was too tired. In addition to being a win for William, the Normans' eventual breach of the English lines at Hastings when the renowned arrow hit Harold in the eye was a direct result of the events at Stamford Bridge. Imagining what could have occurred if Harald Hardrada had exercised more caution is fascinating. Had he kept his army focused and well-equipped, he could have maintained sufficient sentries. Would he have won at Stamford Bridge against Harold? Could he have ascended to the throne of England if he had? What changes might history have undergone? On the other hand, consider what could have happened if Harold had been given a few extra weeks to recuperate his army following Stamford Bridge, reorganize his forces, and recruit reinforcements from all throughout the kingdom before facing William at Hastings. It is probable that Harold would have conquered the Normans if his army had been refreshed and replenished. Anglo-Saxon England would still exist today. The evolution of the English language would have been drastically different, and the course of England's and the world's following history would have been entirely different. But hypotheses don't work in history. The world we live in today was formed by what transpired and its effects. The final significant Anglo-Saxon military triumph was the Battle of Stamford Bridge. It additionally signaled the end of the Viking warrior era and the start of a new European order ruled by feudal countries such as Normandy.
The loss at Stamford Bridge was terrible for the Vikings who made it back to Norway. They returned vanquished, their commanders dead, their dreams dashed, having set out as conquerors, confident of their wonderful future. The fight is described in the E.C. Norse sagas with a mix of pride in the valor shown and sorrow about the extent of the loss. Stamford Bridge served both as a tragedy and a lesson in humility for a society that placed an absolute importance on glory and combat. Because of its teachings on the value of readiness, military intelligence, and strategic speed, Stamford Bridge is still studied by military historians today. Harold's march from London to York is still regarded as one of the best illustrations of medieval military mobility. From Napoleon to Patton, commanders across the ages realized that surprise and quickness might be just as important as superior technology or sheer numbers. The conflict also highlights the value of leadership and morale. Harald Hardrada lost something essential when he fell, even though his warriors kept fighting. On the battlefield, having a charismatic and famous leader can make all the difference, and losing them can be catastrophic. One of the reasons Harold Godwinson personally fought on the front lines of both of the main wars he fought in 1066 is because he knew this. The human cost of these conflicts must also be considered. Every one of the thousands of soldiers who perished at Stamford Bridge had a unique story, family, aspirations, and dreams.
They were human beings whose lives were cut short on the battlefield, but they were also warriors in the power struggles of monarchs and lords. It is hard for us moderns to completely understand how horrific medieval warfare was. Fortunately, few of us today have to endure the terrible experience of hand-to-hand fighting, direct physical carnage, and tremendous physical tiredness. Today, the location of Stamford Bridge is serene. The location of the fight, where a lone Viking held an entire army at bay, is marked by a little plaque. And the River Derwent still runs calmly beneath the new bridge that replaced the old wooden one. Today, the grounds where thousands perished are used for farming. The memory of that gory September day endures, yet life continued as usual. Seeing historic battlegrounds and picturing what transpired there has a profoundly poignant quality. Although Stamford Bridge lacks the notoriety of Hastings or Waterloo, the events there had an equally important impact on the path of history. The Viking era essentially came to an end there. There was the fall of the last great Viking monarch. Anglo-Saxon England achieved its final significant triumph there prior to the Norman conquest. We can also learn about the nature of wartime fortunes from the Stamford Bridge narrative. Among the most prosperous persons of his era was Harald Hardrada. He had conquered a kingdom, gained great money, and fought innumerable battles. However, a single day of misfortune and bad choices erased all of this. Everything changed with a single arrow. This serves as a reminder that even the strongest people can fail and that human destiny is brittle. A number of things contributed to the Vikings' poor preparedness that day. Initially, there was the innate arrogance of fighters who had recently routed an English army at Fulford. The second was that an army would take weeks to gather and march north, and Harold Godwinson was thought to be in London. Third, it was tempting to abandon heavier armor because of the mild weather that September day. At the time, each of these choices looked sensible, but taken as a whole, they produced a deadly weakness. Harold Godwinson, however, made choices that, although they were risky at the time, turned out to be wise. It was dangerous to march his army till they were exhausted. Once his forces were there, it might have prevented them from fighting successfully.
Another huge danger was attacking right away without allowing his men to recover. Harold, however, realized that speed and surprise were worth the dangers. He placed all of his money on one final blow, and it was a perfect one. It is impossible to overstate the importance of military intelligence in this battle. Harold was fully aware of the Vikings' location and timing. He was probably informed of the scheduled meeting at Stamford Bridge by informants or spies in York. He was able to precisely prepare his attack thanks to this information. Having detailed awareness of the enemy's movements was extremely valuable in medieval warfare, when communications were slow and information was frequently faulty. More thought should be given to Stamford Bridge's topography. The bridge itself benefited defense because it was a natural choke point. The Vikings could have built an almost impenetrable defensive using the bridge if they had had more time to prepare. An entire army may be held at bay for a considerable amount of time by a single warrior. After all, what if Harald Hardrada had had time to assemble a sizable force at the bridge, complete with enough spears and arrows? For hours or perhaps days, the English might have been stranded across the river. However, Harold's speed deprived the Vikings of this chance. Only a small contingent of warriors could be sent in to defend the bridge before it was too late, since the Vikings were still gathering when the English arrived. The battle became an open conflict as the English crossed in force, and planning, equipment, and numbers were crucial.
Another intriguing element is the employment of archers in combat. Even though heavy infantry using axes and swords dominated most medieval English battles during this period, archers were essential. Harald Hardrada was slain by an arrow, which drastically changed the outcome of the conflict. This portends the growing significance of archers in upcoming English conflicts, which would culminate in the catastrophic triumphs over French cavalry at Crécy and Azincourt centuries later. Armor is another intriguing question. Chainmail constituted the majority of medieval armor during this time. Thousands of overlapping metal rings that were hot and heavy, but offered decent protection from wounds. Between 20 and 30 kilograms of equipment could be carried by a fully armed warrior with a full chainmail helmet, shield, and weapons. This became really uncomfortable on a sweltering day in September. When English swords and axes discovered exposed flesh, several Vikings lost their lives because they had left their chainmail on ships. All of the English were fully armed and had marched straight into combat. In the intense hand-to-hand fighting that defined the conflict, this disparity in protection was crucial. An opponent without proper protection was significantly outmatched by a warrior wearing full armor. Combat psychology also played a part, regardless of the unprotected fighter's skill level. The Vikings were experienced fighters who had witnessed innumerable conflicts, particularly those who had served in the Varangian Guard or other campaigns around the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. The sight of their supposedly unbeatable king dying, however, and the surprise of being assaulted when they believed they were safe, their capacity to fight successfully was significantly impacted by these psychological shocks. The Huskels were fighting on the English side to protect their homeland. They were aware that if they failed, their culture would be destroyed, their families might be killed or sold into slavery, and foreign invaders would take over their territories. Good soldiers can become amazing warriors with this kind of motivation, fighting to defend everything you cherish. The English developed a fierceness that matched the Vikings' mythical renown as a result of their desperate defense of their territory. The battle's tactics capture the essence of medieval warfare in the 11th century. This engagement did not involve heavy cavalry. Both sides mostly used infantry in their battles. The predominant strategy was shield wall formations, which produced strong lines of fighters attempting to breach adversary formations by using tactical maneuvers, greater skill, or raw force. In its most basic form,
It was attrition-based warfare, with the victor being the team that could hold its position and battle the longest. The fighting inside these formations was ruthless and disorderly. Frontline fighters pushed their shields against their adversaries to throw them off balance or make space. Swords, axes, and spears were pushed into these gaps in search of any exposed area of the enemy's body. The formation gained weight and velocity as men in the rear lines pushed those in front. Movement became even more difficult as injured guys were trampled and fell. It must have been an overwhelming sound, the sound of metal on metal, wood on wood, the screams of pain and dread, the battle cries, the orders screamed by commanders attempting to keep their lines in order, and the distinct scent of blood, perspiration, and panic permeated everything. Medieval warfare was a full-bodied, sensory-rich activity that put the soldiers' mental fortitude and physical bravery to the test. Another important factor is how long the conflict lasted. The majority of the day was spent at Stamford Bridge, most likely starting in the middle of the morning and ending in the early evening. It takes incredible endurance to fight a physical battle for so long. The warriors weren't engaged in constant combat during this period. In order to collect their breath, reassemble, and drink water, formations would occasionally pause and split up. Nevertheless, the emotional and physical toll must have been immense. For comparison, even the most fit modern athletes found it difficult to maintain high levels of physical activity for longer than an hour or two. These soldiers from the Middle Ages fought for 6 or 8 hours while toting bulky weapons.
It is astounding how much physical conditioning is needed for this. Their bodies were fighting machines, refined by years of practice and real-world combat experience. These were guys who had dedicated their whole lives to war preparation. The story takes on a sad dimension when Rickal's Viking reinforcements arrive at the end of the conflict. These men accomplished a remarkable physical feat by running more than 6 miles while fully armored. They came with the intention of turning the tide of the conflict, saving the day, and rescuing their fellow soldiers. Rather, they discovered a scene of bloodshed where their leaders and companions were either already dead or near death. Even though they knew they would probably lose, they battled to the very end, keeping their loyalty pledges. This intense devotion was a hallmark of Viking civilization. When a warrior was vowed to serve a lord, they were supposed to battle beside the lord until they died. There was no greater dishonor than to flee a combat where their leader had been killed. Therefore, these Viking reinforcements launched themselves into battle with the ferocity of men who knew they were fighting their final fights, despite being fatigued from their run and seeing how terrible the situation was. Though fleeting, the storm of awe was powerful. Throughout the day, the English had already demonstrated their supremacy. They were in the lead. At that point, many Vikings had fallen, giving them superior numbers and the assurance that triumph was coming. The Viking lines were systematically breached, encircled, and demolished. The surviving eventually dispersed over the countryside, where they were hunted mercilessly by English riders. The conflict must have had a terrible aftermath. The meadows surrounding Stamford Bridge were covered in thousands of dead. The injured groaned, pleading for either death or water to put an end to their agony. The English triumphants, who were themselves worn out and severely injured, set about the difficult chore of caring for their own casualties while gathering supplies and equipment from the deceased. After the Vikings died, their bodies were either abandoned to decay or interred in mass graves. The trip home was unimaginably depressing for the Vikings who were still alive. Dreaming of grandeur and conquest, they had departed Norway. They came back broken, poor, and defeated. The conflict had wiped out most of the Norwegian nobility. Whole families were ruined. Villages were deprived of males of fighting age.
Norway would not fully recover from this devastating loss for decades. The win was momentarily lauded in England. There was no time for extensive celebrations after the Norman invasion. Harold promptly started getting ready to march south, dispatching messengers to gather militia from around the kingdom and recruiting fresh men to replace those lost at Stamford Bridge. But time was against him. William of Normandy gained more time every day to fortify his own defenses and solidify his hold on the southern shore. Even at the time, Harold's choice to march south right away to face William was contentious. He should wait, assemble a stronger army, and let his men to rest and recover, according to some of his advisers. However, Harold thought the same tactic would work against the Normans because he had triumphed at Stamford Bridge by being quick and decisive. Unfortunately, he did not have luck this time. When viewed as a whole, 1066 depicts a Shakespearean drama. Three monarchs vie for the throne. Harold Godwinson loses the second battle and dies on the battlefield after winning the first one magnificently. If Harold had had a rested army, William of Normandy may have lost, but instead he takes control of England and alters the path of Western history forever. Perhaps the finest fighter of his period, Harald Hardrada, underestimates his opponent and perishes in an ambush. These lessons touch on deeper truths about the human condition and go beyond military history. Arrogance is a recipe for disaster. That was something Harald Hardrada discovered the hard way. Harold showed that speed and decisiveness may defeat stronger forces. Harold also learned that even great triumphs can be meaningless if they expose you to fresh dangers.
And who wins and who loses, who lives and who dies is largely determined by pure chance. This larger reality was symbolized by the Stamford Bridge. Empires clashed, and the future was determined at a little wooden building that crossed a small river. The landscape wasn't particularly striking. There were no great plains or stunning mountains. In Yorkshire, there was only a river and a bridge. However, the events there have had a lasting impact across the ages. The meaning of the war changed for the fighters' descendants. It was the final major triumph of the Anglo-Saxon forebears of the English before to the Norman conquest. It marked the end of a period of Viking splendor and a national tragedy for the Norwegians and Scandinavians. Stamford Bridge was a windfall for the Normans, who would soon overrun England, weakening the English army and enabling their own triumph at Hastings. It's simple to overlook the actual human cost of the battles that took place there when we visit them now. It's difficult to believe that thousands of men perished in those peaceful settings and verdant fields. However, we would experience unimaginable horror if we could travel back in time and visit Stamford Bridge on that September day. We would witness young men, many of them were still in their teens, fighting and losing their lives for causes they hardly understood. We would witness the savagery of medieval combat in all its gore. This isn't meant to romanticize violence or exalt conflict. Is to serve as a reminder of the real price of strife, ambition, and power. Each person on that battlefield stood for a life gone, a family broken, and human potential squandered. Although kings and commanders are frequently the subject of history, the average soldier suffers the most. In the end, a number of interrelated elements combined to create the secret weapon that decimated the Vikings at Stamford Bridge. It was the strategic speed of Harold Godwinson. It was his attack's tactical surprise. It was the English Hussar's skill and discipline. The Vikings' lack of preparation was the cause. It was Harald Hardrada's untimely death. Once the assailants crossed the bridge, the topography worked in their favor. When the English fought to protect their homes, their morale was higher.
Together, these elements formed a perfect storm that drove the Vikings off the battlefield, even though none of them would have been sufficient on their own. This combined warfare lesson about combining many components into a logical plan is still applicable today. Stamford Bridge is studied by modern militaries, not because the particular strategies are still relevant. Although shield walls are no longer used in combat, the fundamental ideas remain the same. Intelligence, morale, leadership, speed, surprise, and readiness. In today's conflicts, all of these elements still influence wins and losses. We must consider this battle's role in the greater narrative as we come to the end of our trip through it. Despite not being as well known as Hastings, Agincourt, or Waterloo, Stamford Bridge has had a similarly important historical impact. The Viking Age, which had influenced Europe for more than 200 years, came to an end with this event. It was the final effort to subjugate England by a sizable Scandinavian army. It proved that the Anglo-Saxons could compete with any European military force if they were properly commanded. Ironically, Harold Godwinson sealed his own doom by annihilating the Vikings to such a great extent. History might have been quite different if Harold had had more time to be prepared before fighting William and if Stamford Bridge hadn't been so expensive. But there are no second chances in history. We make choices, fight conflicts, and deal with the fallout. Nobody could have completely foreseen what would happen as the sun sank over the blood-stained meadows of Stamford Bridge that September evening. With stories of tragedy and dread, the remaining Vikings set off on their protracted journey home. Unaware that he would be murdered and his kingdom overrun in less than 2 weeks, Harold Godwinson started organizing his next campaign. William of Normandy, whose fortunes changed every hour Harold stayed in the north, was waiting somewhere in southern England.
The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a basic conflict between armies in which the finest planning, leadership, and execution won out. It was a moment of pure historical simplicity. No intricate betrayals or drawn-out political intrigues influenced the result. It was just a battle between two armies, and the strongest won that day. Even in the midst of the horror of war, there is something nearly pristine about this simplicity. Over the ages, Stamford Bridge's lessons have been remembered. It teaches leaders the value of constantly being well prepared and never underestimating your opponents. It illustrates the crucial importance of speed and surprise for strategists. It demonstrates to warriors that training and discipline are just as crucial as unadulterated bravery. It also serves as a reminder to all of us that human choices shape history. Some are prudent, some are careless, but each has repercussions that extend well beyond the time it is made. As we come to the end of this account of the war that decimated the Vikings, we must recognize that there are tales of incredible bravery mixed in with all the bloodshed, loss, and suffering. Knowing he would perish, the lone Viking bought time for his fellows by defending the bridge by himself. Even though they were fatigued, Feist and Norrie and his soldiers hurried into battle to aid their friends. To protect his kingdom, Harold Godwinson led his army in a march that was beyond human endurance. Despite his ancient age, Harald Hardrada continues to battle on the front lines. These brave tales cut across national boundaries. They talk on how brave people can be, even in the worst situations. Thus, we are left with complicated ideas after reading about the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Anglo-Saxon England achieved a spectacular triumph, but only a few weeks later it would be destroyed. The Viking era was coming to an end, but it was a wonderful one, with every last man fighting against insurmountable odds.
It served as both a lesson that things might change drastically and a proof of how strong leadership and astute tactics can defeat even the most feared soldiers. The grounds surrounding Stamford Bridge are serene now, but maybe the echoes of that horrible and beautiful day could still be heard if we could listen back through the ages. The shouts of warriors, the groans of the injured, the clash of shields, and the quiet testimony of thousands of men who fought and gave their lives there, their identities forgotten by history, all contributed to the world we live in today. In the end, human will, used with cunning, speed, and unwavering will, was the hidden weapon that wiped out the Vikings. It was Harold Godwinson's inability to concede defeat, his readiness to stake all on a bold move, and his capacity to motivate his soldiers to do remarkable things. It served as evidence that, much like in life, the strongest and most seasoned do not necessarily prevail in conflict, but those who are most flexible, have the clearest minds, and take the most decisive action. That brings this epic trip through one of the most important days in medieval history to a close. Human bravery, the cruelty of war, and the capricious role of fate in shaping history are all still demonstrated by the Battle of Stamford Bridge. May we never forget the lessons learned from this conflict. Remember the people who fought and lost their lives there, and be thankful that such brutal wars are uncommon in many parts of the world these days. We are filled with a deep sense of thankfulness as we consider everything we have talked about, the lives lost, the choices made, and the outcomes that have influenced centuries of history. Appreciation for the people who came before us, whose hardships and sacrifices made the world we live in possible. Thankfulness for the chance to gain knowledge from the past and comprehend the influences that molded our society. Above all, we are grateful to the Lord God, who, in his boundless wisdom, guides human history through all of its complexities, who was on that battlefield in 1066 just as he is with us today, who gives hope even when all else seems lost, and who has remained steadfast and faithful through all of human history's triumphs and tragedies. May we possess the faith to believe in the future, the courage to face the present, and the knowledge to learn from the past, never forgetting that God has given us life and all of its potential as priceless gifts. Amen.